When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. It wasn't a proud smile. It wasn't a smile of relief or victory. It was quiet, gentle, empty. Because in that moment, my heart felt like it had been walking through fog for years, and now the fog had thickened around me. I remember standing in the kitchen, the sunlight slipping through the small window above the sink. I could hear the kettle humming softly on the stove, the sound like a gentle reminder that life keeps moving, even when you feel frozen in place. I held the cup of tea I had just poured, and my hands shook a little, not from anger, not from fear, but from the slow, sinking ache that comes when someone you love no longer sees you.
Mom, maybe it's better if you stay somewhere else for a while, Clara said, her voice tight, rehearsed. Her eyes avoided mine. They looked past me, through me, like I was a stranger walking in someone else's home. I nodded slowly, setting the cup down on the counter. Of course, dear, I said softly. I'll leave. Don't worry about me. She looked surprised at my calmness. Maybe she expected tears or a confrontation, but I had learned long ago that tears don't always help. Sometimes they just wash away a little piece of your own strength. I walked to the door, my steps quiet against the old wooden floor. I could hear Ethan's laughter in the living room, the sound of him talking about something mundane, something I used to know every detail of. And yet, I was invisible. I paused for a moment, my hands on the doorknob. I wanted to call his name. I wanted to tell him that his mother was leaving, that she still loved him even if no one else did. But the words caught in my throat. Because what could I say that would matter now? I smiled faintly, a soft, bittersweet smile. A smile that said, I forgive you, even if you don't see me. And then I stepped out. The world outside seemed unchanged. The sun still poured down in golden slants across the street. The trees swayed gently in the wind. Birds chirped as if nothing had happened. But inside me, something had shifted. A small door had closed quietly, and I wasn't sure it would ever open again. I walked slowly down the steps, feeling the cool air brush against my face. I remembered the first time I held Ethan in my arms. His tiny fists, his soft, warm body pressed against my chest. I had promised then that I would always protect him, always be there for him. And now, I felt that promise stretch into a long, empty distance. I thought about all the little moments that had led here. The times I stayed awake with him during fevers. The mornings I made him breakfast and packed his school bag. The nights I whispered prayers, asking God to keep him safe. All of it felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who had forgotten me. I sat on the small stone wall by the gate, my bag resting on my lap. The wind carried the smell of rain from the clouds above, heavy and thick. I watched neighbors go about their day, children playing, couples walking hand in hand, and I realized that life had moved on around me, faster than I could follow. A young mother walked past with her baby in a stroller, smiling at the child's squeals. I remember doing the same with Ethan when he was little. And a strange ache, sharper than anything else, filled my chest. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was just lonely.
But even in that loneliness, I felt something else, a quiet resolve. I would not let this moment define me. I would not let their forgetting of me erase who I was or the love I had carried all these years. I would carry it quietly, gently, like a flame in the dark. That evening, I went back into the house one last time before leaving. I ran my fingers along the edges of the furniture, touched the backs of chairs, the worn countertop where Ethan used to sit doing homework. I whispered goodbye to the rooms, to the echoes of laughter and tears, to the small memories that had built the world of my son's childhood. I wrote a short note, not to make anyone feel guilty, but to release the weight from my heart. I love you all, always. Remember me kindly. I folded it carefully and left it on the kitchen table, where maybe someone would see it, maybe not. And then I walked out, carrying nothing but my own quiet strength. Even now, I can feel that day in my chest, the weight of being unseen by the person I loved most. And yet, paradoxically, that day also planted the first seed of something I would need in the years to come. Patience, resilience, and the gentle understanding that love doesn't vanish just because it isn't returned the way we hope. I did not know then what the coming months would bring. I did not know that my own health would falter, that letters would be written and unread, that small encounters could break hearts again and heal them, slowly, softly, in ways no one could predict. But that day, the day I smiled while being left behind, was the beginning of a long, quiet journey. A journey of love, of forgiveness, of waiting, and of learning that sometimes the hardest part of love is letting it exist, even when the person you love cannot see it. My house has always been small, but it is full of memories. The kind of memories that cling to walls, to worn furniture, to the faint scent of old books and flowers. Every corner reminds me of Ethan, his tiny shoes by the door, the little backpack he once left on the kitchen chair, the marks on the wall where his height was measured every year. When he was young, our mornings were always rushed but full of laughter. I would wake before dawn, make tea for myself and hot chocolate for him, and sometimes, just sometimes, I would steal a moment to watch him sleep a little longer before the chaos of the day began. He would wake up, stretch his small arms and say, "Good morning, Ma," with a yawn that made me smile despite the tiredness that had begun to set in even then. We weren't wealthy. We didn't have much, but we had enough. Enough love, enough warmth, enough small rituals that made life bearable. Breakfasts were noisy, chaotic, and messy. Ethan would insist on putting sugar in his cereal until it clumped together. I would shake my head and laugh. "You'll ruin your teeth," I'd say. "I don't care," he would reply, grinning with crumbs around his mouth. And I would sit there, sipping my tea, smiling at the boy who thought the world was made just for him. Ethan was always curious, always asking questions that made me pause. "Why does the rain fall, Ma? Why do people fight? Will I ever be brave enough to help someone who's scared?" Sometimes I didn't know how to answer. Other times I just held his hand and said, "You'll find your answers, Ethan. You just have to keep looking." He would nod thoughtfully, as if he understood more than he could yet explain. And that was the boy I raised. Sensitive, loving, quick to laugh, slow to anger. I poured myself into him, sometimes forgetting my own needs. I didn't mind. A mother's love is like that. Quiet, patient, endless. When he grew older, things began to change. Slowly. Teenage years arrived like a shadow at dusk, sometimes barely noticeable, other times sudden and sharp. He started spending more time at school, then with friends. He would come home later, sometimes forgetting to tell me where he had been. I tried not to notice, tried not to make him feel trapped. But there were nights when I lay awake, listening to the empty house, wondering if I had done enough, said enough, loved enough. We didn't fight. There were no big arguments, just small distances that grew quietly, like cracks in a wall that no one sees until the light shines through. By the time Ethan married, our home had become quiet in ways I had never known it could be. His laughter, once echoing through every room, had moved into a different house. His stories, once told over shared tea and bread, were now told elsewhere. Clara was a kind woman, I told myself. She smiled, she spoke politely, and she cared for him in ways only a wife could. But I began to notice things. Small things, like how she would roll her eyes when I lingered too long in the kitchen, or how Ethan seemed to shrink a little when she was around. I tried to tell myself it was normal. New families create new spaces. Children grow and parents adapt. Yet there were moments that stung. One evening, I had baked a small cake. Nothing fancy, just a simple sponge with a little frosting. I had thought, maybe they'll come for tea. Maybe they'll smile like they used to. When I offered it to them, Clara shook her head gently. "Mom, it's fine. We have other plans," she said. Ethan looked down, embarrassed, and for the first time, I realized something had changed. I smiled politely, hiding the pinch in my heart. "Of course," I said. "I'll just put it in the fridge." I didn't tell them that it hurt, because by then I had learned to carry the hurt quietly. My days became routines of small things. I would sweep the floor, water the plants, feed the stray cat that came by every morning, and check on my little garden out back. I would cook simple meals and eat quietly, sometimes listening to the radio, sometimes to the silence. And always, I would think about Ethan. Sometimes I would call, but often I didn't, afraid of bothering him, afraid of hearing the polite, distant voice of a son who had grown into someone else. I remember one afternoon, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, watching him walk past my house on his way to work. He didn't see me. He never waved. I stayed where I was, smiling faintly because I couldn't let him see how much it hurt. Love can be like that, quiet, patient, enduring. It doesn't demand. It waits. There were neighbors who tried to reach out. Mrs. Johnson, a sweet woman next door, would sometimes bring over small parcels, a loaf of bread, a jar of jam. She would chat with me about the weather, the neighborhood, the small joys of life. I was grateful, of course, but she could not fill the empty space that my son's absence had left. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit by the old radio, listening to music I had loved as a girl. Soft piano, stringed instruments, songs about love and longing. I would close my eyes and imagine Ethan as a boy again, small hands in mine, sleepy eyes, a warm laugh that could make the world seem right. And in those quiet moments, I remembered who I was.
Not just a mother forgotten, but a woman who had loved deeply and who still carried that love quietly, like a candle in a dark room. I would write letters to him sometimes, not to send, just to pour out my thoughts. Dear Ethan, I hope you are well. I miss you sometimes, though I do not say it aloud. I remember the mornings when you would run to the kitchen for breakfast, the afternoons when we played cards, and the nights when I tucked you into bed. I hope you carry some of our memories in your heart, even if I am not there to remind you. Love, Mom. The letters stayed in my drawer, unread, but writing them gave me something I couldn't otherwise have, a way to feel close to him even when he was far away. It was during those quiet days that I began noticing small changes in my own health. A little breathlessness here, a little dizziness there. I told myself it was nothing, just age, just tiredness. But sometimes, when I sat in the garden watching the sunset, I felt my chest tighten slightly, and I wondered, silently, what if I cannot wait for him much longer? Even then, I didn't call. I didn't want him to worry. I only whispered his name softly in my prayers, hoping that somehow, through all the distance, love would reach him and he would feel it. That was my life before the storm. Quiet, careful, patient. A life of memories, routines, and invisible love. A life where every day I waited, silently, for a son who had once been my whole world to notice that I was still here.
Life, I realized, has a way of creating distance, slowly, quietly, until one day you wake up and it feels as though the people you love are no longer there. Ethan had always been my boy, but marriage had changed him, or perhaps it had changed the world around him. The first time I noticed the shift, it was subtle. I had baked cookies one Saturday afternoon, his favorite, the kind with chocolate chips that would melt just right in the center. I placed them on a small plate, wrapped them gently, and walked to his house with hope in my chest. Clara opened the door. "Oh, Mom," she said, her voice polite yet distant. "Thanks, but we already have snacks. You don't need to." I stopped myself from saying anything more. I smiled, as I always did. "It's no trouble," I said softly. "I thought he might like them." Ethan appeared behind her, and for a brief moment, I thought he would smile, maybe hug me, maybe say, "Thank you, Ma," but he didn't. He looked at the plate, then at me, and nodded quickly. "Thanks," he said, and turned away. I walked back home with the cookies in my bag. Not because I was angry, not because I felt rejected, because I had learned, slowly, that sometimes love has to wait silently without recognition, without gratitude. Days turned into weeks. Ethan stopped calling as often. Even when he did, his words were short, clipped, as if he were speaking to someone he barely knew. I listened patiently, never complaining, never trying to force conversation. I reminded myself that people get busy, that life moves on, and that I must wait. But each passing day brought small stings, reminders that I was no longer central to his life. One evening, I had stayed up late cleaning his old room. It was now empty, the walls bare, but I wanted to keep it tidy. As I dusted the shelves, I found a small toy car he had left behind. I held it in my hands, feeling the grooves worn smooth by his little fingers. I remembered the nights he had played quietly on the floor while I cooked, the mornings he had begged me for one more story, And then I remembered the day he had left for college. The tears, the promises, the way he had hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'll come home soon." He hadn't come home in the same way since. Tensions grew not out of anger, but out of misunderstandings. Clara began to insist, gently but firmly, that I should give them space. At first, I didn't mind. I understood. But sometimes her words carried a weight, a subtle message that I wasn't needed. "You're a wonderful mother, really," she said one afternoon. "But maybe Ethan needs to figure things out without influence from you." I nodded politely. "Yes, of course," I said, swallowing the pinch in my chest. It wasn't her I was upset with. It wasn't even Ethan. It was the reality that my son had grown into a life where I no longer fit. The smallest things became reminders. One afternoon, I baked a small loaf of bread, the kind he loved with butter and honey. I walked to their house, my heart hoping for a brief connection. Clara opened the door again, polite but distant. "Mom, it smells wonderful, but we just ate." Ethan stood behind her, glancing at me with a mixture of guilt and awkwardness. I smiled. "No problem, just thought I'd bring a little something." He took the bread silently, then went back into the living room. I lingered for a few moments, unsure whether to leave immediately or try to speak. I chose to leave, quietly stepping down the steps and feeling the weight of my own invisibility. I began noticing small things in their interactions that I hadn't before. Ethan no longer mentioned my advice about work or life. He no longer called to ask for recipes or guidance. Even Emily, his daughter, seemed to only know me as grandma from stories, not from experience. I reminded myself again, love doesn't demand attention. It waits. Yet at night, in the quiet, I allowed myself to cry softly. There were conversations that could have been bridges if only they were not avoided. One day, I saw him scrolling through his phone, and I asked quietly, "Ethan, is everything okay?" He glanced up quickly. "Yes, Ma, everything's fine." But there was tension in his shoulders, a heaviness in his voice I hadn't heard before. "Really?" I asked softly. "Yes," he repeated, a little more firmly. I didn't press further. I understood that sometimes adults hide things to protect themselves or others, but it hurt, silently, knowing that my son, my boy, was carrying burdens I couldn't help with. I tried small gestures, quiet acts of love that didn't demand attention. I left a basket of fresh fruit at their doorstep once. I baked bread or cookies when the weather was cold. I wrote small notes, nothing long, nothing dramatic, just a few lines to say I was thinking of them. Sometimes they received these gestures with smiles and thanks. Other times they were ignored. I told myself it didn't matter. Love is not measured by recognition, but the tension, the distance, the quiet ache. It began to weigh on me. I remember sitting by my window one rainy afternoon, watching the droplets trickle down the glass. I held a warm cup of tea and whispered, "Why did it come to this? How did I become invisible to my own son?" No answer came. Only the rain and the faint hum of life moving on outside. Even when he did visit, it was never the same. He would sit across from me at the table, polite, distant.
Conversations would skirt around feelings, around memories, around the truth that something important had been lost. I began to notice a subtle tension in the air, a quiet fear of saying the wrong thing, of being too close, of stirring up something better left untouched. And yet, in small moments, I caught glimpses of the boy he had been. A laugh at a small joke, a sigh when a memory came to him, a fleeting look that reminded me he was still my son. That was the paradox of those years. Love was present, but fragile. Communication existed, but only in half words and gestures. Our hearts were connected, yet the distance made the connection ache like a slow, steady throb.
One evening, I tried to speak honestly. "Ethan," I said softly, "I miss you." He looked down and the tension in his body grew. "I know, Ma," he said quickly, almost defensively. I'll come more often." I nodded, understanding that promises can be empty when life is busy. "I just hope you know I'm here. Always." He didn't answer immediately, but I felt something shift. A small flicker, a thread of connection stretching across the silence. Those were the years of quiet struggle. The years when I learned patience in ways I never expected. The years when I realized that love doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like waiting. Sometimes it looks like small gestures that go unnoticed. Sometimes it looks like a mother carrying the ache of absence silently, faithfully, endlessly. And it was during those years that I began to write letters I would never send, bake bread that might go uneaten, and whisper prayers that might never be heard. Because in that quiet love, I found a strength I didn't know I had, and I knew that one day life would bring a turning point. I remember that day as if it were etched in my bones. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes every shadow longer, every sound softer. I had been preparing a small meal, thinking Ethan might stop by. It had been weeks since he visited, weeks of quiet letters, quiet thoughts, quiet waiting. I heard the doorbell ring. I straightened my apron and wiped my hands on a towel. When I opened the door, I saw him, my son, tall now, grown, carrying himself like a man who would learn to live in a world where mothers exist only in memory. Behind him stood Clara. Her smile was polite but firm, like a shield. And then I knew, before any words were spoken, that this visit would not be simple. "Hi, Ma," Ethan said softly. I smiled, as I always did. "Hello, Ethan. It's good to see you." Clara spoke next, carefully. "We're just passing through. We have a busy day, but I thought he could stop by for a few minutes." I nodded, trying to keep the warmth in my voice. "Of course. Come in." They stepped inside. I set the small meal on the table. Nothing fancy, just bread, tea, and a little soup. Ethan sat down, his hands clasped tightly together. I noticed how tense he was, how guarded.
And in that moment, my heart sank because I understood the boy I had raised was still there, somewhere, but hidden beneath years of life, of distance, of careful self-protection. We ate quietly. Clara and I exchanged small words about the weather, the garden, the cat. Ethan said little. He looked at the meal, then at the floor, then at me, avoiding my gaze. After a while, Clara stood. "I think we should be going. We have an early appointment." I smiled politely. "Of course." I tried to speak softly to Ethan. "We can talk another time. I hope you know that I'm always here." He nodded, but there was no warmth in his eyes. And then it happened. As he turned to leave, he walked past me. Not quickly, not angrily, just past me, like I was a stranger. I froze for a moment, the world narrowing down to that one motion. His shoulder brushed against mine, but he didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. And in that silence, I felt years of waiting, of longing, of love, all unacknowledged collapse in an instant. I wanted to reach out, to touch his arm, to call his name. But I didn't. I smiled instead. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It wasn't a bitter smile. It was quiet, resigned. A smile that said, "I love you anyway." Once they left, I closed the doors slowly. The sound of the latch felt loud in the silent house. I sank into the nearest chair, my hands trembling slightly. The tears I had held back all these weeks began to fall. Not in anger, not in resentment, just in quiet, deep sorrow. I thought about all the mornings I had made him breakfast, all the nights I had whispered prayers for him, all the times I had stayed awake with him during fevers, all the letters I had written that were never read. And in that moment, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. My son had grown distant, and I had no control over it. The days that followed were heavy. I kept busy, as I always did. I cleaned, I cooked, I watered the plants, I wrote in my diary. But a part of me remained with that moment. Ethan, walking past me as if I were invisible. I began remembering everything. The small moments that had led here. The missed calls, the polite nods, the dinners that ended too quickly, the subtle tension in the air whenever Clara was around. And I understood that this was the breaking point. I began writing letters again, but this time they were different. Dear Ethan, I am here. I am always here. I love you, even when you do not see me, even when you walk past me. I do not ask for words or recognition. I only ask that you remember that my love exists quietly, patiently, endlessly. Love, Ma. I folded them carefully, not sending them. I wanted him to feel my presence, even if he did not acknowledge it. Weeks passed. The loneliness became a quiet companion, but it was not the same as grief. It was softer, more contemplative. I began thinking about what it meant to be a mother. Was it simply to raise a child? Or was it to love without expectation, to wait without complaint, to carry their absence with patience? I realized that love is not always seen. It is often quiet. It does not demand. It does not protest. It simply exists. Then came the letter. One morning, the postman delivered a small envelope. It was from Ethan. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of his words before I even opened it. Inside, there were only a few lines. "Ma, I'm sorry. I don't know how to say this, but I've been distant. I didn't mean to hurt you. I got lost. I'll come by soon. Ethan." I sat down slowly, tears rolling down my cheeks. It wasn't a reunion. It wasn't a resolution. It was a beginning. That night, I sat by the window and whispered prayers. I prayed not for answers. I prayed not for forgiveness. I prayed for patience, for strength, for the quiet hope that love, even when ignored, would eventually find its way back. Days turned into weeks. Ethan didn't come immediately, but the letter was enough to remind me he had not forgotten. And in that quiet realization, I felt something shift within me. I understood that the turning point was not his return. It was the moment I accepted the distance, the moment I loved him without expectation, without bitterness, without resentment.
The days that followed felt lighter, though life continued quietly, without drama. Ethan visited more often, sometimes just to drop in with Emily. I noticed the small things, the way he would glance at me and smile, the way he would ask quietly about my day, the way Emily would run to me without hesitation. Those moments became treasures, simple, ordinary, yet profoundly meaningful. I spent more time in the garden, tending to flowers and vegetables, enjoying the sun on my face. I would sip tea by the window, watching the world go by, feeling grateful for the quiet rhythm of life. The house was no longer just a home of memories. It had become a place of presence, of small joys, of gentle connection. One morning, as I was arranging fresh flowers on the kitchen table, Ethan came in. "Ma," he said softly, "Emily wants to help me make breakfast." I smiled. "That sounds wonderful. I'll join too." We worked together, chopping, stirring, laughing over small mishaps. Emily giggled when she spilled some milk, and Ethan laughed too, lightly, unguarded. And in that moment, I realized something beautiful. The bonds that had been stretched, even broken, were slowly knitting themselves together again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't a fairy tale. But it was real. I began noticing the little ways life reminded me of love. The smell of fresh bread in the morning, the soft sunlight falling across the living room, the quiet shared smiles that needed no words. I understood that love is not always dramatic or loud. It is patient. It is enduring. It shows up in moments you might almost overlook, in tea shared, in stories told, in hands held for a fleeting second. I continued writing my thoughts in letters, though now they were more reflections than pleas. Dear Ethan, life moves slowly, and sometimes we forget what is most important. I see you now, present, kind, patient. I see Emily growing with love and joy, and I am grateful. Grateful for every small moment we share, every laugh, every story, every quiet glance. Love endures, and we endure with it. Love, Ma. I kept these letters in a small wooden box, a record of patience, hope, and resilience. They were reminders not of pain, but of healing. One evening, as the sun set in soft gold, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. Ethan entered quietly, carrying Emily on his hip. She ran over and hugged me tightly. Ethan smiled, standing beside her. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The love was there, quiet, but unmistakable. I realized then that life had taught me something invaluable. We cannot control the hearts of others. We cannot demand recognition or love, but we can carry it with us. We can nurture it quietly, and sometimes that love returns gently, softly, in its own time. I thought about all the years of waiting, of letters written and unread, of small gestures unnoticed. I thought about the ache of absence, the silence of distance, the slow, patient hope that never gave up. And I smiled, because love endures, because patience heals, because life, though sometimes painful, also offers moments of unexpected joy, connection, and understanding. I understood that my story, of being unseen, of being walked past like a stranger, was not a story of loss alone. It was a story of resilience, of enduring love, of quiet strength. It was a story of healing, of gentle reconciliation, of hope. And I whispered a prayer of gratitude for it all, for the love that never disappeared, for the son who slowly remembered, for the family that was quietly finding its way back to me. The house was quiet again, the sky soft with twilight. I sipped my tea, watching the shadows lengthen, and I knew that no matter what the future held, love would remain, patient, enduring, and quietly present, like a gentle flame that never goes out. That acceptance became my strength. It became the beginning of the healing that would follow. Sometimes I think back to that day, the day he walked past me like I was a stranger, and I smile softly, because that moment, as painful as it was, taught me the most important lesson. Love does not demand recognition. Love does not need validation. It is patient, enduring, and quiet. And if it is true, it always finds a way back. The days after that turning point were quiet, almost fragile. Ethan began visiting more often, though never as frequently as I wished. And yet, even in those small visits, I noticed a change, a subtle shift in the air, one that hinted at recognition, at care, at a thread of connection slowly being rewoven. Emily, his little daughter, became a bridge between us. Her laughter filled the house in a way that reminded me of the boy Ethan once was. She would run to me without hesitation, asking me to braid her hair, read her stories, or help her draw in her coloring book. And I welcomed her with open arms, knowing that through her, I could still share love with my son, even if indirectly. I remember one afternoon, when the sky was pale with soft sunlight, that Ethan and Emily came over for tea. Emily dashed around the living room with her crayons and sketchbook. I watched her, smiling softly as she hummed the little tune. "Grandma, look, I drew you and Daddy," she exclaimed, showing me a crayon drawing that was charming in its simplicity. I knelt down, touching her small hand. "It's wonderful, sweetheart. You are very talented." Ethan stood nearby, his eyes quiet, watching us. I caught a glimpse of the boy I once held, the one who had laughed at my silly jokes, who had sought comfort in my arms, who had trusted me completely. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the distance wasn't permanent. Perhaps love, patient and endearing, was beginning to return. We sat down for tea together. The conversation was slow at first, hesitant. Ethan spoke about work, about Emily's school, about small daily things. I listened, occasionally asking questions, keeping my voice gentle, never pressing too hard. At one point, I said softly, "Do you remember the mornings when you were little and I would make hot chocolate for you?" He looked down, a small, wistful smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, I remember," he said quietly. I miss those mornings sometimes." I reached out and touched his hand briefly. I said softly, "It's okay. We can remember them together now." It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't a flood of words or tears. It was quiet, subtle, healing. Over the following months, I began to notice more small signs of change. Ethan would call occasionally just to check in. He would ask about my health, my garden, the cat. Sometimes we would even laugh together over old memories, the kind of laughter that bridges years of silence. Clara, too, softened. She began to invite me for small meals, to ask for advice, and to include me in minor family plans. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't as it had once been. But it was enough. I began writing letters again, not because I needed him to read them, but because writing helped me process my emotions, helped me feel close to him even when words were not exchanged. Dear Ethan, today Emily drew a picture of all of us together. I watched her and remembered the mornings I used to make you breakfast. I thought about how much time has passed, and yet how much love remains. I am grateful for the small moments we share now. They mean more than words can say. Love, Ma. I kept them in a small box, like treasures, not as a plea, but as a record of endurance, patience, and quiet hope. One evening, I was in the garden, tending to my flowers, when Ethan appeared at the gate. "Ma," he said softly. I turned and smiled. "Hello, Ethan. Come in." He stepped inside. There was a small hesitance in his movements, a quiet humility I hadn't seen in years. He carried Emily on his hip, her little hands clutching his shoulder. We spent the afternoon together. Emily played and drew, while Ethan and I talked quietly about work, about memories, about small things that mattered. He laughed softly at a memory of his childhood, a genuine, unguarded laugh, and I felt my heart lift a little. Healing did not come all at once. There were still moments of tension, still moments when he would withdraw, still moments when I felt the ache of absence. But those moments no longer had power over me. I had learned to sit with them, to acknowledge them, and to let them pass without bitterness. One rainy afternoon, Ethan came by unexpectedly. The rain was soft, tapping against the windows. He entered quietly, holding an umbrella, dripping slightly. "I brought some tea, Ma," he said, smiling faintly. I laughed softly. "Thank you, Ethan. You didn't have to."
He shrugged. I wanted to. That evening, we sat by the window together, watching the rain. No words were needed. Our presence was enough. Emily became the center of many moments of joy. She would run to me after school, excited to share her stories, her drawings, her small adventures. And Ethan, for the first time in years, seemed relaxed in my home. He would sit on the sofa, sharing memories, small jokes, and sometimes, quietly, just sitting, allowing the past to settle like dust in the sunlight. It was not perfect. It was not a fairy tale. It was real, bittersweet, healing. One afternoon, while Emily was napping, Ethan and I sat in the kitchen.
I I know I hurt you, he said softly, his eyes downcast. I didn't mean to. I got lost in life, and I forgot what mattered most. I reached out and touched his hand. It's okay, Ethan. I understand. You didn't forget completely. You're here now, and that is enough. He looked up at me, a mix of relief and gratitude in his eyes. I I want to do better, Ma, for Emily, for us. I smiled softly. I know you do. That's all I need to know. The resolution was not about dramatic words or grand gestures. It was about small moments, a shared cup of tea, a quiet conversation about nothing in particular, laughter over a silly childhood memory, the soft touch of a hand, a fleeting hug, a smile. It was about realizing that love, once strained and distant, can slowly return. Not all at once, and not always perfectly, but it can return. I began to notice the subtle changes in myself, too. I was calmer, more patient. I learned to find joy in small things: the smell of rain, the sunlight on the kitchen floor, the sound of Emily's laughter. I learned that love doesn't always demand recognition, and that forgiveness is not about the other person. It is about freeing your own heart. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I would sit by the window and watch the stars. I would think about the years of waiting, the letters I wrote but never sent, the meals prepared but never eaten, and I realized something profound. Love does not disappear. It waits. It endures. And sometimes it returns in ways quieter, gentler, and more precious than you ever expected. I no longer measured the distance between us. I no longer counted the days between visits. I simply embraced the moments we shared, however brief, however imperfect. Because healing is not about forgetting the pain. It's about learning to carry it lightly, to transform it into patience, understanding, and love that endures. The days that followed felt lighter, though life continued quietly, without drama. Ethan visited more often, sometimes just to drop in with Emily. I noticed the small things, the way he would glance at me and smile, the way he would ask quietly about my day. The way Emily would run to me without hesitation. Those moments became treasures, simple, ordinary, yet profoundly meaningful. I spent more time in the garden, tending to flowers and vegetables, enjoying the sun on my face. I would sip tea by the window, watching the world go by, feeling grateful for the quiet rhythm of life. The house was no longer just a home of memories. It had become a place of presence, of small joys, of gentle connection. One morning, as I was arranging fresh flowers on the kitchen table, Ethan came in. "Ma," he said softly, "Emily wants to help me make breakfast." I smiled. "That sounds wonderful. I'll join too." We worked together, chopping, stirring, laughing over small mishaps. Emily giggled when she spilled some milk, and Ethan laughed too, lightly, unguarded. And in that moment, I realized something beautiful. The bonds that had been stretched, even broken, were slowly knitting themselves together again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't a fairy tale. But it was real. I began noticing the little ways life reminded me of love. The smell of fresh bread in the morning, the soft sunlight falling across the living room, the quiet, shared smiles that needed no words. I understood that love is not always dramatic or loud. It is patient. It is enduring. It shows up in moments you might almost overlook, in tea shared, in stories told, in hands held for a fleeting second. I continued writing my thoughts in letters, though now they were more reflections than pleas. Dear Ethan, life moves slowly, and sometimes we forget what is most important. I see you now, present, kind, patient. I see Emily growing with love and joy, and I am grateful. Grateful for every small moment we share, every laugh, every story, every quiet glance.
Love endures, and we endure with it. Love, Ma. I kept these letters in a small wooden box, a record of patience, hope, and resilience. They were reminders not of pain, but of healing. One evening, as the sun set in soft gold, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. Ethan entered quietly, carrying Emily on his hip. She ran over and hugged me tightly. Ethan smiled, standing beside her. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The love was there, quiet but unmistakable. I realized then that life had taught me something invaluable. We cannot control the hearts of others. We cannot demand recognition or love. But we can carry it with us. We can nurture it quietly. And sometimes that love returns, gently, softly, in its own time. I thought about all the years of waiting, of letters written and unread, of small gestures unnoticed. I thought about the ache of absence, the silence of distance, the slow, patient hope that never gave up. And I smiled. Because love endures, because patience heals, because life, though sometimes painful, also offers moments of unexpected joy, connection, and understanding. I understood that my story of being unseen, of being walked past like a stranger, was not a story of loss alone. It was a story of resilience, of enduring love, of quiet strength. It was a story of healing, of gentle reconciliation, of hope. And I whispered a prayer of gratitude for it all, for the love that never disappeared, for the son who slowly remembered, for the family that was quietly finding its way back to me. The house was quiet again, the sky soft with twilight. I sipped my tea, watching the shadows lengthen. And I knew that no matter what the future held, love would remain, patient, enduring, and quietly present, like a gentle flame that never goes out.